Okay, well, welcome everybody to this week, Solar Noon Tuesday. And I want to start out as per usual. We'll start with what's happening in the wonderful world of solar as far as what's in the news this week. Then I do want to throw it open to any kind of comments, anything anybody has, any questions, whatever. Try and keep it all very informal. And then I did pick a topic today. We're going to talk about. I've had a lot of questions from people about preparing their homes to have electric vehicles, and sort of the subheading of this is: will 400 amp service become the new norm? Kind of interesting. I mean, there's just a lot of activity as we try and electrify everything. We're going to have bigger service on our residents. So let's jump into the news from the solar industry for the week of November 7th, this week. And Google signed a large power purchase agreement with 4 different Texas solar projects. And what they're hoping to do here is to offset the electricity they use in their Texas data centers. To give you a sense of just how much power that is, an average data center will take about 100 megawatts of generation capacity. That's the equivalent of about 80,000 homes. So Google is going to be trying to offset that there in Texas. They've made a commitment corporately to be carbon-free by the year 2030. These 4 projects in Texas are anticipated to generate about 10,000 jobs there. And this is going to be essentially a utility scale project. So they will be using First Solar panels. Those are made in Ohio. They're the largest thin film panel manufacturer in the United States. Then the University of Pittsburgh announced that they're going to be breaking ground on a 20 megawatt solar array. This is going to be located near the Pittsburgh airport. It's going to be 68 acres in size, about 55,000 panels there. They hope that this will generate about 18% of all of the power needs for the university. They are, again, also going to be doing this through a power purchase agreement with a Texas company called Vesper Energy. The advantage of power purchase agreement, of course, is there's no upfront costs. Basically, Vesper is an investor. They're going to come in, develop the system, and then they sell the energy that's being produced from it to the university at a discounted rate, much less than what they would be able to get it from a utility. Now, the university anticipates they're going to be saving millions of dollars over the course of this power purchase agreement. They have pledged to be 50% renewable by 2030, the university has, and 100% by 2037. The other interesting thing about this array is it will be pollinator friendly. So apparently that was a negotiated item. Well, they'll plant pollinator friendly landscaping around it. And then they're also going to be installing a training facility for the University of Pittsburgh for those people going into the solar industry at this unit. Okay, then the CSA group is going to be opening up or expanding into a 40,000 square foot battery testing facility. And the battery testing facility will be in their headquarters there at Independence, Ohio. They've been headquartered there since 1969. One of the reasons they're expanding into battery testing is with the emphasis on batteries in the industry, a lot of need for manufacturers to have all of these systems tested to the new standards, not only the standard for batteries per se, but how do they integrate within energy systems as a whole. And there was a recent report that just came out saying that renewable energy actually slowed down a little bit in the 3rd quarter of this year. So really from July to September, we saw about 3.4 gigawatts installed. That's down about 22% over the same period last year. The reason cited is, of course, supply chain interruptions. They're having a lot of trouble getting shipments of panels and other equipment through customs. because of some of the tariffs and all of those restrictions. But the big thing is interconnection agreements, the interconnection permission from the federal government. There's a huge backlog of these applications. In fact, they say currently there's a backlog of about 36 gigawatts of systems waiting to go online, still awaiting permitting. That's double the amount of solar that was installed in 2021. So huge backlog. What they are anticipating, even with this a little bit of a slowdown, that the Inflation Reduction Act will have a significant impact on the amount of solar installed over the next 10 years. Texas and California are the largest markets at the moment for installation. And I saw a report in here that Amazon actually has installed 2 gigawatts of solar just for their own corporate needs, which I find kind of interesting because just 10 years ago, essentially Amazon now has more solar than the entire country had 10 years ago. And they're anticipating that the Inflation Reduction Act will see demand of about 550 gigawatts of power over the next 10 years, solar, representing about $600 billion in capital investments. So the 550 gigawatts is essentially 4 times as much as currently exists in the country. And there's an Indiana electric company, AES Indiana. They announced they're going to be converting 2 of their coal power plants into natural gas. This is about 1 gigawatt. It's part of their process. And this is something that pretty much all of the utilities are in the process of doing, is shutting down their coal power plants. They're just not economic in comparison with the alternatives. But they're not all just jumping into renewable. As this example, they are some converting to natural gas, very inexpensive thing, since essentially it's the same kind of process, same kind of infrastructure required. They anticipate that this switchover will save about $381 million over replacing it with solar plus storage. But that doesn't mean that AES is not shifting to renewables. In fact, they currently rely on about 50% of the power generation is from coal. They're going to be phasing that out. They anticipate at the end of their 20-year plan, they'll be at about 87% renewables, solar, wind, and solar plus storage. In fact, they do have current plans over the next 5 years to install 1,450 megawatts of solar, 300 megawatts of wind, and 450 of solar plus storage. So pretty much that's the news that I have from the industry this week. Anybody have any comments on that? Yep. All right. And anybody have anything they want to raise here for the good of the cause before we get into my little canned presentation here about upgrading? Anybody have a question? I see some. Yeah. One
of the questions I wanted to ask, if Google is going that big onto First Solar, is this an endorsement of thin film technology? In the past, I know that cadmium telluride and cadmium sulfide and some of the other ones had relatively short lifetimes. Have they gotten those problems ironed out at this point? I mean, Google is pretty smart.
Yeah. Well, I do know that the vast majority of utility scale systems are going with the thin film technology for whatever reason. And First Solar is the largest beneficiary of this. So in fact, they just announced they're expanding to the tune of $1.2 billion of expansion in their Ohio manufacturing facility. So I haven't actually looked at one of those panels. I'm just assuming it's thin film encased in glass, and I'm not really sure which of the chemistries they're using. But as you say, they typically, you think of, at least I've always thought of thin film as like a 10-year panel, where the other panels, the silicon, are 25 or even 30-year panels. So
Right.
I wouldn't imagine they're planning on these things, but you never know with these companies. They're the ones who build a Walmart and then tear it down 3 years later and build one across the street. So they may look at it as, hey, the thing's fully depreciated. Now's the time to tear it down and start all over. And of course, the power purchase agreement, or not the power purchase, but the production credits that the utilities get from the government for producing are 10 years in duration. So, gosh, I'd hate to think that they're planning on these things all being trashed in 10 years. So, does anybody else have any perspective on that? Any comments on that? Yeah. Okay. Any other questions before we jump in? And again, if you do have some as I'm talking, feel free to interrupt. You're probably on mute right now. You'll have to unmute yourself to, so some of you may be shouting right now. So
one of the other thoughts that I'm thinking of is in terms of the parallel between the solar transmission approval and the transmission backlog that they have in different, I know that the Southwest Power Pool and some of the other transmission regulators have had difficulty in trying to get things through largely going out of state. Within the utilities territory, they have had fairly good luck getting transmission approved, and they like them because they're fairly profitable. But they've had trouble trying to go outside of state with many of their large projects. I'm thinking of the Grain Belt Express and some of the other big wind transmission systems that were expected to bring Texas, West Texas wind power to Georgia and to east of the Mississippi, and it's kind of parallel with some of the difficulties they're having with transmission for solar at this point.
Well, of course, Texas is always a unique case because when you look at the regulatory nature, there's sort of the East Coast, the West Coast, and then Texas, because Texas, has to be different. They're like the Quebecois up in Canada. There's the country and then there's Quebec. So that may be part of it, at least as far as Texas is concerned. I know that there is some transmission difficulty between the East and the West. So I think everybody has their own little regulatory barriers, which my understanding is why in the long distance transmission lines, they often convert over to DC, and then they can reconvert back to whatever the local format is once they cross over. But I know FERC is holding a lot of hearings about how to free up this mess with interconnection. I just saw an article where Google, Facebook, Amazon, all these other big corporations jumped on board to kind of help push them in that direction. There was discussion about first ready should be first permitted. That kind of made sense to me, apparently, as part of it. It's not so much I'm ready to get permitted. It's more like I applied first. So therefore you got to walk through that. They're also talking about bundling applications. So that's interesting to, a lot of these common sense things that the rest of us would have thought it would have been just a no-brainer, but this is government oversight. So apparently they've got to have, I don't know, some Midwestern farmer come in and tell them how to run their process or something. So, and somebody just posted that it was cadmium telluride. So that's the chemistry for the first solar. Any other comments? Okay, well, let me jump in. I found when I was, let's see, how do I do this? There we go. I found when I was doing preparation for this, oftentimes when I'm trying to come up with a topic for the weekly discussion, something pops up. And actually, when I was teaching at Westerville Electric, this came up a bit about having to upgrade services for customers. And I was asking them, do they charge for this or whatever? And they're a municipal electric company. So they're pretty friendly, a bit like a co-op. So they do a lot of this kind of thing at no charge. But we're seeing a lot of announcements around electric vehicles. And of course, for instance, you'll see the growth of electric vehicles. Hopefully everyone on this call understands that electric vehicles are the future of transportation. We're still in the very, very early stages on this. And as a result, it occurred to me that we need to start planning for this and for other things in our building of homes or upgrading of our own homes. I was thinking about this for our own property. What size circuit do I need if I'm going to be installing a charging station? Well, the Ford Lightning that just came out this year, it requires an 80 amp charging station. This has a 92 kilowatt hour battery on the base model and something bigger like a 130 kilowatt hour battery on the more deluxe. So it requires an 80 amp circuit, and that's just assuming you're only going to have one electric vehicle. Now imagine a family that had two of these wanting to charge in the garage, and of course they have 100 amp service. So that's one appliance essentially. So I was thinking about the Silverado, the Chevy Silverado that's coming out next year. And they purportedly have a 200 kilowatt hour battery. And I did some research trying to figure out what size charging port they're going to require. Couldn't find anything there, but if we do some math, they do say that this 200 kilowatt kilowatt hour battery has a range of about 400 miles. So if we assume there's about 10% charging losses, and if we just had a 40 amp breaker, then you would be able to get about 32 amps of charging going on. So 32 amps times 240 volts means you're going to get 7.68 kilowatt hours per hour. You divide the 220 into that, and you find that to charge that using a 40 amp breaker, it's going to take 28.6 hours to charge your Chevy Silverado. That's from empty to full. So that's not a very typical thing, but it's a long time. So my guess is they're going to require a bigger charging point. 60 amps probably minimum, maybe 80 amps. Then if you wanted just to charge for 100 miles, let's say you're commuting 100 miles a day, still going to take at that range or at that amperage about 7 hours. So you could get about 100 miles at night, parking it in overnight. And just out of curiosity, I put in what is the dollar figure per mile or per gallon equivalent. And for this particular thing, if they are getting 50 kilowatt hours to get your 100 miles, so 15 cents per kilowatt hour, $7.50. And if you figure miles per gallon of about 20 miles to the gallon, you're really talking about $1.50 per gallon equivalent. So EV charging, even paying full retail for your electric right now, is quite a bargain. So my guess is we're going to need a much larger circuit there. So at that point, most homes today, well, a lot of the older homes have 100 amp service. The sort of default standard at the moment is 200 amp service coming in from the utility. But is that enough if we move into this world of electrifying everything? You know, currently, most of those homes have natural gas furnaces. Well, if we move away from natural gas furnaces, start going into electric heat as well as electric air conditioning, then you start talking about 2-car garages with 2 electric vehicles in the garage. then you're going to be requiring that. Then you throw in the obligatory hot tub, hot water heating that will likely be electric versus natural gas, especially if you're electrifying everything. And it's not unusual to think, or it's not far-fetched to think that's going to be the case. For instance, California has banned natural gas in new construction. So a lot of folks are moving away from natural gas. And if I think if we see more of these fossil fuel disruptions, we're probably going to see more of a movement towards electrifying everything, which means bigger service. So if I want to upgrade my service, let's say from 200 amps to 400 amps, well, then you're going to be looking at about $2,500 to $3,000 just to upgrade the panel. I would think that if you're building a new home, you should anticipate 400 amp service just automatically. Doing that when you're building the home is gonna save you a lot of money. There may be a fee for this upgrade from the utility. Currently, a lot of utilities just come out and do it, especially the co-ops and the municipals. But my guess is, as there's a rash of individuals requiring these kind of upgrades, these utility companies are going to start charging for that. So do you need a 100 amp circuit into the garage? Is even 100 amps going to be enough for the charging stations? Maybe you need 120 if they're going to be two 60 amp charging stations, possibly going at the same time. Then we get into the issue of the NFPA 855, and that's still a question. We don't know how they're going to come down on that, but at the moment they're saying that if you're using your batteries in your vehicle bidirectionally to serve as a backup to your home, you can only do that for a maximum of 30 days on a temporary basis. And they're also trying to move batteries outside. Currently, that NFPA 855 says you can't have more than 80 kilowatt hours of battery in your garage or outside, even connected to the building. Well, you've got a Chevy Silverado with a 200 amp hour battery, or not amp hour, but kilowatt hour. You're already violating that. So how is that going to come into play? So a lot of things still need to be decided. And then the other thing that's interesting, at least it was interesting to me, many of you may already know this, but in 2020, the code was changed to require that there be an emergency service disconnect. Basically a disconnect between the meter and your main. So what I did is pulled up the code. It's actually in the NEC 230.85. So what the code now requires is for all new buildings, and then significantly, if you do a significant upgrade, which would be if you're upgrading to 400 amps and you got to put in a new panel, that would be considered a significant upgrade. So you're going to have to put in an emergency disconnect on your system, something where they can turn off the power into your home from the utility without actually having to pull the meter. And that's going to be outside. And I put a little picture of it here. And basically, gotta do these over here. There we go. Everything's backwards, but right over there. I think this is going to be the norm on your utility meters. You're going to see the meter itself, then under the meter is going to be like a main disconnect, and then ports for a number of connection points. That's actually going to be quite good for solar installers, because now if you want to bring a solar array into the facility, a residential facility, you don't have to drill through the wall to get into the main service panel anymore. You can just connect into a double pole breaker on this little sub box there. So, but once again, this needs to be installed, and that's not going to be cheap, I'm sure. So anytime you're going to be upgrading your service or doing any kind of electrical work, and I'm not sure, but I would assume in some jurisdictions, adding a solar array will be considered a major upgrade. And so this box may need to be installed as part of any residential installation. Probably wouldn't be a bad idea to try and put that in to the bids anyway. Again, this was in the 2020 code, and not every jurisdiction has adopted the 2020 code yet, but you may start seeing inspectors requiring this. Okay, so that was some of my comments there. I'm sure some of you guys have perspectives on this. Anybody want to chime in, or have you seen these disconnects going in anywhere, or has any inspector told you this is what you got to do?
I just heard recently from a fellow in Wichita who said that he had several house rental properties that he was wanting to put solar on, and one of the disadvantages to him was that there is a trigger law where it's one of those laws that anything over, and it was an absurdly low limit. It was like adding like 10 feet or 20 feet to the circuit would trigger an upgrade for the whole electrical system to bring it up to current, to the current standards, which in Wichita could be still 2017 or 2018 or something like that. But it was a law that makes it very difficult to add solar to anybody's property in that county. So I know there are trigger laws already going into effect.
Yeah, I saw a presentation by somebody in California who was talking about, apparently there were a lot of changes where they essentially required you to move the service entrance away from gas lines and gas meters if you upgraded. Now we have this emergency disconnect. So he was saying that he's seen homeowners with as much as like a $30,000 cost to upgrade their service, just because they were making major repairs or major upgrades. So if that's going to be the case in some jurisdictions, it really makes solar unaffordable for a lot of folks. Okay, any other comments from the group?
Do you think there's a retrofit package for that, like as opposed to replacing the entire meter assembly? I mean, could there be like an add-on?
I think it's it looks like it's a pretty straightforward box. It's kind of interesting. I never even thought about this, but the guys at the utility were telling me, because I said, well, the utility typically owns the meter. And they go, yeah, we own the meter, but you own the box. So I thought, what, really? That's something that's differentiated. So my guess is it's not a huge cost for the product itself. Most service panels are only a couple $100, but the cost is in the actual installation. Because obviously this would require that the service be disconnected from the utility in order to do that. And in most jurisdiction and most logic would dictate that electrician has to be the guy doing this. But wouldn't be a bad idea. I mean, if you're going to do a service panel upgrade anyway, you're going to have an electrician in there. So may as well do them both at the same time.
Jay, if they have smart meters, does this have any consequence?
I don't think so. I think the smart meter is a fairly self-contained thing, but that's just my impression. I don't have a lot of insight into it. Although the people at the utility were quite annoyed by everybody thinking smart meters give them brain cancer or whatever. They're going, really? Put away your cell phone if you're concerned about your smart meter. So. Okay. Anybody else? All right. Well, then we'll call it a meeting and we'll see you all next Tuesday. All right. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Jay.
Thank you. Bye-bye.